Most people use Google Earth to plan trips or settle arguments about geography. But Pennsylvania has places that will make you deeply regret opening that search bar. Ancient battlefields soaked in blood, towns literally burning from below, asylums that should have stayed locked. This state has layers of history that satellite imagery makes uncomfortably real. So consider yourself warned, don't search for these 10 Pennsylvania places on Google Earth. Place number 10, Centralia, Columbia County. Let's start with the one that looks from above like it used to be a town, because it was. Centralia in Columbia County had about 1,100 residents as recently as 1980. Today, it has 5. Not 500, 5. And if you pull it up on Google Earth, you'll see something genuinely disorienting. A full grid of streets, perfectly intact, leading to nothing. Empty lots, foundations. A graveyard sitting at the top of a hill with smoke rising from the earth around it. Nature trying very hard to take back whatever space it can. The reason all of this happened is one of the stranger industrial disasters in American history. On May 27, 1962, members of the Centralia Volunteer Fire Company were hired by the Borough Council to burn trash in the town landfill, an abandoned strip mine pit near the Oddfellows Cemetery. This had been done before. It had always worked before. This time, an unsealed hole in the pit allowed the fire to tunnel directly into the labyrinth of abandoned coal mines underneath the borough. The fire caught a coal seam and simply never stopped. Repeated attempts over the following 2 decades, excavation, backfilling, pumping, slurry injection, all failed. By 1979, carbon monoxide levels in basements were reaching dangerous concentrations. By 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski nearly died when the ground opened beneath his feet and he fell into a steaming sinkhole. He managed to grab a tree root and was pulled out. That incident ended the debate about whether people should keep living there. In 1984, Congress allocated more than $42 million for resident relocation. In 1992, Pennsylvania Governor Bob Casey invoked eminent domain on all property in the borough, condemning every building within. The U.S. Postal Service discontinued Centralia's zip code in 2002. Most buildings have since been demolished. The fire is still burning. Today it reaches depths of up to 300 feet, covers roughly 8 square miles, advances along 4 separate fronts at about 75 feet per year, and is estimated to have enough coal remaining to keep burning for another 250 years. At its recorded peak, ground surface temperatures in certain parts of Centralia reached 1,350 degrees Fahrenheit. The abandoned section of Pennsylvania Route 61, cracked open, buckled, regularly exhaling steam from the ground below, has become one of the most photographed stretches of broken pavement in the country. It also served as partial inspiration for the Silent Hill video game and film franchise, which is set in a fictional, burning Pennsylvania coal town. Bill Bryson, writing about his walk through the area in the late 1990s, described finding himself at the edge of a vast cauldron, perhaps an acre in extent, which was emitting thick, cloud-like, pure white smoke, with ground that felt warm underfoot and was covered in fine ash. And that was just the surface. The actual fire was hundreds of feet below. From Google Earth, Centralia looks like a town where someone just removed all the buildings and left the streets behind, which is more or less exactly what happened. Place number 9, Eastern State Penitentiary, Philadelphia. Eastern State Penitentiary opened in Philadelphia in 1829, and its basic premise was this: total silence, total isolation, total reflection. Each prisoner was confined alone in a cell, worked alone, exercised alone in their own private yard, and was forbidden from speaking or communicating with any other human being. The architects and theorists behind the design genuinely believed that absolute solitude would lead to genuine moral reform. They called it the Pennsylvania system. It didn't work. As a rehabilitation strategy, it mostly produced severe mental illness. But it did produce one of the most architecturally imposing prison buildings in America. Eastern State was designed by John Haviland and built in a Gothic castle style, with a massive stone facade and a radial floor plan that let a single guard standing at the center see down every cell block at once. When it opened, it was the most expensive building in the United States. People came from around the world to tour it as a marvel of modern penology. The prison held some notorious names over its 142-year operation. Al Capone spent just over 7 months there, arriving on August 8, 1929, and released on March 17, 1930. After a conviction for carrying a concealed weapon in Philadelphia, bank robber Willie Sutton escaped from Eastern State in 1945, along with 11 other inmates, through a tunnel they had dug over the course of about a year. He was recaptured the same day. Among the practices used during the prison's operation were the mad chair, where prisoners were strapped completely immobile for days at a time, the iron gag, which was clamped to the tongue and chained to the hands to prevent speaking, and placement in the hole, an underground isolation chamber with no light, no warmth, and no sensory input of any kind. The prison closed in 1971 and sat abandoned for nearly 2 decades. It reopened for tours in 1994 and is now a National Historic Landmark, maintained as what they call a preserved ruin, meaning the crumbling cell blocks, the peeling paint, the collapsed ceilings are intentionally left as they are. The building covers roughly 10 acres in the Fairmount neighborhood of Philadelphia. During its operation, more than 75,000 people were incarcerated there. The last warden before closure, William Banmiller, reportedly said the institution had become too deteriorated and overcrowded to operate humanely. From Google Earth, the building looks like a medieval fortress dropped into the middle of a dense Philadelphia neighborhood. The radial cell block pattern, 7 cell blocks extending from a central rotunda, allowing a guard at the center to see straight down every corridor, is still clearly visible from above. It's a strange and striking thing to look at, and it doesn't stop being strange even after you've looked at it for a while. Place number 8, Pennhurst State School and Hospital, Spring City. Pennhurst opened in November 1908 in Spring City, Chester County, originally under the name Eastern Pennsylvania State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. That name alone tells you something about the era. It was designed to provide care for people with mental and physical disabilities from across southeastern Pennsylvania. Within 4 years of opening, it was already overcrowded. The combination of chronic underfunding, understaffing, and the prevailing attitudes of the time toward disabled people created conditions that deteriorated steadily over the following decades. By the 1960s, Pennhurst was housing more than 900 patients above its official capacity. In 1968, local Philadelphia TV journalist Bill Baldini aired a 5-part investigative series called Suffer the Little Children, which documented what he found inside the institution. Adults chained to cribs, children locked in cages, patients left in their own waste, and staff so overwhelmed that meaningful care was effectively impossible. One newspaper at the time called Pennhurst the shame of Pennsylvania. In 1974, a class action lawsuit, Halderman versus Pennhurst State School and Hospital, was filed on behalf of residents. The U.S. District Court found the facility unconstitutionally overcrowded and determined that residents were being subjected to illegal conditions that violated their constitutional rights. The case wound through the courts for over a decade, going to the U.S. Supreme Court twice before a final settlement was reached. In 1983, 9 employees were charged with physically abusing patients. Pennhurst closed permanently on December 9, 1987. The complex originally consisted of at least 32 buildings spread across 633 acres in Spring City. Many have since been demolished. What remains sits largely abandoned and decaying. A sprawling campus that, on Google Earth, looks like a small town unto itself, but one that no longer has any obvious purpose. The cluster of institutional buildings set apart from the surrounding community reflects, with uncomfortable accuracy, how Pennhurst operated throughout its 8 decades. Physically and socially separated from the world outside its gates, operating by its own rules, largely invisible to the public, until a television camera finally walked through the door. Place number 7. Gettysburg Battlefield, Adams County. The Battle of Gettysburg was fought July 1st through 3rd, 1863, and produced between 46,000 and 51,000 combined casualties, dead, wounded, captured, or missing, making it the costliest single battle in American military history. More than 7,000 soldiers were killed outright over those 3 days. The ground in and around Gettysburg absorbed an almost incomprehensible amount of violence in a very short window of time. From Google Earth, the battlefield is visible in remarkable detail. The fishhook-shaped ridge system, where the Union Army established its defensive position, Seminary Ridge, where the Confederates massed, the broad open fields where Pickett's charge sent approximately 12,000 Confederate soldiers walking directly into rifle and artillery fire. It's all there, laid out with a clarity that ground-level visits sometimes obscure. The specific spot worth pulling up is Devil's Den. Located at the south end of Hook's Ridge, it's a boulder-strewn formation that had its foreboding name before the battle. Local 19th century residents believed a giant snake lived in the crevices between the rocks, reportedly ranging from 8 to 15 feet long. On July 2nd, 1863, the second day of the battle, it became the site of some of the most intense close-quarters fighting of the entire engagement. More than 5,000 soldiers from both sides fought among the boulders. Confederate sharpshooters fired from the rock formations at Union positions on Little Round Top. The wounded had nowhere to go. After the armies finally withdrew, photographer Alexander Gardner documented the human wreckage left behind. After the armies finally withdrew, the dead lay among the boulders for days. Very few had been buried before Gardner arrived with his camera. On Google Earth, you can see the distinctive boulder formations of Devil's Den clearly, the surrounding rolling farmland, and the vast scale of the battlefield itself. It's peaceful looking from 400 miles up. It was not peaceful in July 1863. Place number 6, abandoned Pennsylvania Turnpike, Bedford and Fulton counties. In 1940, the Pennsylvania Turnpike opened as one of the most celebrated feats of American highway engineering. A 160-mile, 4-lane road crossing the Appalachian Mountains, the first long-distance limited-access highway in the United States. It used 7 tunnels bored through mountain ridges. The tunnels were built on the abandoned roadbed of the South Pennsylvania Railroad, a project begun in the 1880s with backing from Andrew Carnegie and William Vanderbilt that was never completed. So from the beginning, the Pennsylvania Turnpike was already recycling one failed infrastructure project. By the late 1950s, the tunnels were a massive problem. The 4-lane highway narrowed to 2 lanes inside each tunnel, causing 5-mile backups on summer weekends. The state decided to either twin 4 of the tunnels with new parallel bores or bypass the remaining 3 entirely. 3 tunnels, Laurel Hill, Rays Hill, and Sidling Hill, were bypassed and abandoned. The Sidling Hill and Rays Hill tunnels, along with a 13-mile stretch of highway between them, were abandoned when the bypass opened on November 26, 1968. And that's how Pennsylvania ended up with a 13-mile stretch of fully intact 4-lane highway sitting in the middle of the Buchanan State Forest, complete with painted lane markings, guardrails, and 2 enormous tunnels that hasn't carried traffic since the Nixon administration. The Sidling Hill Tunnel is 6,782 feet long, 1.28 miles, and was the longest of the original 7 turnpike tunnels. Inside, it gets dark quickly. The far opening is invisible, and the acoustics make every sound echo for an unsettling amount of time. Stalactites have formed on the ceiling from decades of dripping water. The walls are covered in graffiti. The Rays Hill Tunnel is 3,532 feet, shorter but dark enough that you'll want a flashlight. The 2009 post-apocalyptic film The Road, starring Viggo Mortensen, was filmed partly at the Rays Hill Tunnel because the production team determined that the location already looked sufficiently like a world that had ended. No set dressing required. On Google Earth, the abandoned stretch is immediately visible. A clean line of gray pavement cutting through dense forest, going nowhere, with two dark rectangular tunnel openings framed by the hillsides. It looks like the beginning of a movie where something has gone very wrong with civilization. The Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission sold most of the property to the Southern Alleghenies Conservancy for $1 in 2001. It's now a hiking and biking trail. Place number 5, Byberry Mental Hospital, Philadelphia. Byberry, formerly the Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry, was a psychiatric institution that operated from 1906 to 1990 on the far northeastern edge of Philadelphia. Over the course of its existence, it became one of the most notorious mental hospitals in the United States, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of decades of steadily accumulating neglect, overcrowding, and systematic mistreatment of its patients. At its peak in the 1950s, Byberry held approximately 6,000 patients, more than double its designed capacity. A 1946 exposé by conscientious objector and attendant Albert Maisel, published in Life magazine, documented naked patients locked in filthy rooms, patients chained to walls, and conditions he compared to Nazi concentration camps. The report contributed to a national wave of psychiatric reform, though the reforms came slowly and unevenly at Byberry. The hospital finally closed in 1990. The buildings were then bought and sold multiple times, with various redevelopment plans that never materialized. For roughly 2 decades, the structures sat vacant on a large campus in what is now a residential neighborhood, accessible to urban explorers, vandals, and anyone else curious enough to walk in. The buildings were eventually demolished, with most coming down between 2006 and 2013. Today, the site has been redeveloped into a residential neighborhood, but for the 2 decades when the structures stood empty, Byberry was among the most documented abandoned buildings in the country. Urban explorers, photographers, and documentary makers all making their way through the crumbling wards and the underground tunnel network that connected buildings across the campus. The tunnels were particularly notable. A subterranean passageway system that had been used to move patients between buildings without letting them outside, which in retrospect says a great deal about how the institution thought about the people in its care. The demolition is recent enough that older layers of satellite imagery in Google Earth still show the institutional campus in its abandoned state. Toggle between image dates, and you can watch a large psychiatric complex disappear and a housing development take its place over about a decade. That kind of time lapse is one of the things Google Earth does better than anything else. Number 4, Raven Rock Mountain Complex, Adams County. Not every unsettling thing on this list is abandoned. Some are very much still operational. Raven Rock Mountain Complex, also known as Site R, is an underground military facility built into Raven Rock Mountain on the Pennsylvania-Maryland border near the town of Blue Ridge Summit in Adams County. Construction began in 1950, and the facility became fully operational in 1953. It functions as an alternate command center for the Department of Defense, essentially a hardened underground Pentagon designed to survive a nuclear attack and allow the U.S. military to continue operating after Washington, D.C. has been destroyed. Some official documents have referred to it as the backup Pentagon, though that understates what it actually is in scope. The facility is reportedly built 650 feet underground and includes multiple large caverns housing office space, power generation, water supply, a hospital, and enough infrastructure to support thousands of personnel for extended periods without surface access. It has been continuously staffed and maintained ever since it was built. You can find it on Google Earth. The ventilation structures and utility buildings on the surface, the access roads, the surrounding security perimeter, it's all there because it's a known facility and has been publicly acknowledged since the 1990s. Former Vice President Dick Cheney was reportedly taken to Raven Rock on September 11, 2001. The strange thing about looking at it from satellite is how ordinary the surface infrastructure looks. A few nondescript buildings in the Pennsylvania woods, some cleared access roads, a security fence. Nothing about the exterior communicates that several hundred feet below, there is a facility designed to survive the end of the world as we know it. Place number 3, the Flight 93 National Memorial, Shanksville. On September 11th, 2001, United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into a reclaimed strip mine field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 10:03 a.m. All 44 people on board were killed, 40 passengers and crew, and 4 hijackers. The passengers had learned through phone calls what had happened at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and they voted to attempt to retake the aircraft. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sounds of the struggle for control. The plane never reached its intended target, which investigators later determined was almost certainly either the U.S. Capitol or the White House. The crash site is in a shallow rural valley in Somerset County, in a part of Pennsylvania that most people driving through would barely notice. The field was previously a reclaimed strip mine, scarred industrial land that had been returned to pasture, in a township that had seen its own share of hard economic history from the coal era. The impact was so severe, the plane hit the ground at approximately 563 miles per hour, that the wreckage was almost entirely underground. The crater left by the impact was about 10 feet deep. Searchers worked the site for weeks. The largest piece of the plane recovered was about the size of a telephone book. The Flight 93 National Memorial was dedicated in 2011, with additional components completed in 2015. The design uses the flight path as a defining element. A 1.5-mile walkway arcs along the trajectory the plane was traveling when it hit the ground, pointing toward the crash site. From Google Earth, the memorial is strikingly visible and geometrically distinctive. The long arc of the walkway, the wall of names, the ceremonial gate aligned with the flight path. The field where the crash occurred is clearly delineated. The design intentionally makes the approach to the crash site a slow, deliberate journey, and that deliberateness reads clearly even from satellite altitude. It's a place that looks like what it is, a memorial to the last moments of 40 people who made a decision under the most extreme possible circumstances. Pull it up and give it a minute. Place number 2, Concrete City, Nanticoke. In 1911, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Coal Company built a housing development for its workers in Nanticoke, Luzerne County. They called it Concrete City, which was not a nickname. It was the actual name, and it was exactly what it sounds like. 20 double-family homes, each constructed entirely of poured reinforced concrete, arranged in 2 rows on a flat stretch of land. The walls were concrete. The floors were concrete. The ceilings were concrete. The interior partitions were concrete. The company's reasoning was practical. The area had a history of mine fires and subsidence, the ground shifting and sinking as underground coal was extracted, and concrete structures were more resistant to this than standard wood frame housing. It also required essentially no maintenance, which was convenient when you were the one providing the housing and paying for upkeep. Workers hated living there. The concrete construction made the homes bitterly cold in winter and suffocatingly hot in summer, with no effective way to insulate the walls. Sound carried through the walls with brutal efficiency. You heard everything your neighbors said and did, which, in a company-owned mining town, where everyone already worked together 12 hours a day, was not a quality anyone advertised as a feature. By 1924, just 13 years after construction, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western had abandoned the development entirely, moved its workers to other housing, and simply walked away from the buildings. That was over 100 years ago. The buildings are still standing. Concrete, it turns out, is very hard to destroy without deliberate effort, and the coal company made no such effort. The 20 homes remain today, sealed off, structurally intact in most respects, covered in graffiti and reclaimed by vegetation. Trees grow out of interior spaces where the floors have collapsed. Vines have worked through window openings, but the walls stand. The coal company wanted a structure that required zero maintenance, and they certainly got one. From Google Earth, the 2 rows of concrete shells are clearly visible in the landscape. A strange, dense cluster of buildings in an otherwise ordinary residential area, obviously different from the structures around them. 100 years of abandonment, and they're still there. Concrete is patient. Place number 1. Jim Thorpe, Carbon County. The last entry is less straightforwardly grim and more historically layered, which, in its own way, makes it worth looking at carefully. Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. The town, not the man, is a small borough in Carbon County in the Lehigh Valley, set in a narrow gorge where Mauch Chunk Creek meets the Lehigh River. It was originally 2 separate towns, Mauch Chunk and East Mauch Chunk. In the 19th century, it was a prosperous coal shipping hub, home to some of the wealthiest families in Pennsylvania. The architecture from that era is remarkably preserved. Victorian mansions, ornate commercial buildings, stone churches, all compressed into a steep, narrow valley. In 1953, the towns of Mauch Chunk and East Mauch Chunk were struggling economically. In a bid to revitalize, they agreed to rename themselves Jim Thorpe, in honor of the legendary Native American athlete, Olympic gold medalist, professional football and baseball player, widely considered the greatest athlete of the early 20th century, in exchange for a donation from his widow and the right to inter his remains there. Jim Thorpe, the man, had no connection to the town. He was from Oklahoma. He had never been to Mauch Chunk. His family members from the Sac and Fox Nation were deeply opposed to the arrangement and made their objections known at the time, but the deal proceeded regardless. His son, Jack Thorpe, pursued legal action for decades to have his father's remains returned to Oklahoma, arguing that Jim Thorpe's burial in Pennsylvania violated the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The case went to federal court. In 2010, a federal judge ruled in the family's favor, ordering the remains returned to Oklahoma. The town of Jim Thorpe appealed. In 2015, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the lower court's ruling on a procedural technicality related to whether the borough qualified as a municipality under the act. Jim Thorpe's remains stayed in Pennsylvania. Jack Thorpe died in 2010 before the final ruling. The mausoleum where his father is buried sits in a park on the edge of a town the athlete never visited in life. From Google Earth, the town sits dramatically in the valley. Steep forested hillsides, the winding river, the dense cluster of 19th century architecture that earned it the nickname, the Switzerland of America. It's genuinely one of the more visually striking small towns in Pennsylvania from the air. The mausoleum where Jim Thorpe is buried sits on the north side of town, clearly visible. It's a beautiful town with a complicated story that raises questions nobody has fully resolved. Which, honestly, is a very Pennsylvania kind of ending. Pennsylvania is a state with an unusual density of history. Some of it celebrated, some of it buried, some of it literally on fire underneath the ground. The 10 places on this list aren't just interesting from satellite altitude. They're places where something significant happened or is still happening, and Google Earth gives you a frame for thinking about scale and geography in a way that photos at ground level sometimes can't. A burning ghost town, a Gothic prison, a demolished asylum whose footprint is still visible in older imagery, a battlefield where the sheer physical scale of the carnage becomes comprehensible only from above, an abandoned highway in the middle of a forest, an underground military bunker built for the end of civilization. Pennsylvania fits a remarkable amount of unsettling history into one state, and most of it is right there, visible from space, waiting for you to look. If you got something out of this video, go ahead and hit that like button. It makes a real difference in helping the channel grow. And if you want more deep dives into the history that doesn't always make the tour guides, subscribe and come along for the next one. There's no shortage of places worth a closer look. Thanks for watching.